Hi, Sarah Key here, talking about breathing, something we all do, but there is an enormous difference between so-so okay breathing and actual proper breathing. So here we go. Why do we breathe? Well, we need to breathe to bring in to bring in oxygen for all our metabolic processes. We also need to expel carbon dioxide and water. Extraordinary fact that 70% of the body's waste is eliminated through breath. Other less obvious influences of proper breathing are to maintain the right acid-alkali balance in the blood. But there's also physical effects of the diaphragm working and the heart and the lungs working, expanding and contracting. The changes in pressure inside the chest actually physically massaging the various internal organs, and by this I mean the heart, which actually sits between the lungs and above the diaphragm, so it's physically massaged it sort of sits there like in a cleavage, and it's physically massaged by the lungs filling up and emptying and the diaphragm going up and down. And the same thing with the stomach, which is literally right below the diaphragm coming down, descending onto the literally massaging the top of the stomach downwards, and also those alternating pressures in the abdominal cavity helping to shunt the food along the gut. It also has an effect on the lymphatic system because there's no actual pump for that. It's totally dependent on the diaphragm working. But also a less well-known benefit of the diaphragm working is that the diaphragm has slips into the attachments of the stabilizers of the lumbar-spinal segments. Fascinating that such an ever-present functioning structure such as the diaphragm actually helps us stay upright. So really most of us tend to overbreathe, and we can see now that normal breathing is between 4 and 7 litres per minute, between 12 and 14 breaths, but asthmatics breathe faster, and people with chronic heart disease also breathe faster. Now there's a cause and effect there. I'll be trying to explain to you that breathing faster actually makes your circulatory system work less efficiently. So this is the way the diaphragm works. It's in relaxed phase. It's bowed up like an umbrella, and with contraction it descends and flattens, and that creates a negative pressure in your lungs which sucks air in. The belly goes out when the diaphragm descends, simply because it pressurizes the space of your abdominal contents. And here is a diagram of the way it would work in a laboratory with a rubber diaphragm on the bottom of a bell jar. Pulling the diaphragm down actually inflates a balloon here. So the air is sucked in passively through the diaphragm, not through your neck muscles. It's really important that the nose is what you breathe in through, and this is the topic of the whole lecture really, nose breathing as opposed to mouth breathing. The nose does perform miracles. The fine hairs in the nose filtering out dust and all sorts of nasty things. The mucous lining of the nose and the upper respiratory tract warming and humidifying the air before it plunges into the depths of your lungs. Also that mucus, we tend to think horrible things about snot and mucus, but really it's wonderful stuff, with nitrous oxide actually sterilising the air. But the smaller intake of the nostril as opposed to the mouth means that the diaphragm has to work harder, which is good for it. It keeps it stronger, it makes it more efficient. And very importantly too, that smaller intake, that beautiful suction effect of the diaphragm descending, actually keeps the lung tissue spongy and elastic, the opposite of what happens in chronic obstructive airways disease. So breathing controls the amount of CO2 we retain. Now we tend to have bad thoughts about CO2, but really it's very good for the body's various systems. But there's not much of it. There's only about 0.03% of carbon dioxide in the air, and we need more than that. We need about 6.5% concentration in the blood, so it's important that our breathing regulates the the loss of CO2, and if we overbreathe we lose too much of it, and there are ill effects to our health because of that. So the breathing, as I mentioned earlier, controls this acid-alkali balance. Now, in a healthy state, our pH should be between of the whole system, if you like. The acid alkalinity of the whole system should be slightly towards the alkaline end. Okay? And between 7.38 and 7.45, about here. This is neutral, pH of 7 is neutral. So in a healthy metabolic state, we've got a slightly alkaline environment. And a lot of the disease processes are potentiated or facilitated by a slightly acidic environment. It mediates some of the pathological processes. Again, the pathological processes are influenced greatly by proper breathing. Now, many of us Westerners, because we're so anxious and because we're always in a hurry, tend to mouth breathe. I feel I'm mouth breathing talking to you now because I'm thinking about it. We tend to gulp air through our mouth using the upper lobes of our lungs only. Here, so we're not really filling up down to the bases here, which is right down at waist level. So if we're only using the upper lobes, left and right, we're only using about a quarter of our lung capacity. And the problem is that we're also not using our diaphragm. We are using what's called our accessory muscles of respiration in our neck, which should only be used in extreme exertion. That also means that we make a noise with the breathing. We tend to go, whereas proper breathing should be noiseless, which I'll explain later. So what happens with mouth breathing is we actually tend to create stress. Because we blow off too much carbon dioxide, we actually create stress. So we get into a vicious cycle that we're stressed anyway, so we're mouth breathing and we're breathing too quickly. But that in turn tends to make us more stressed. Talking too much, stress at work, also affected by what we eat. Our respiratory centre in the brain gradually gets used to the fact that we don't have the proper CO2 levels, and then that becomes normal, and our breathing tends to stay at that rate, and that becomes normal. If you're breathing too much, we want to slow the rate, and we want to make the breathing actually more shallow, believe it or not. If you do breathe, as I said, if you are breathing quickly, you get all these other effects because you don't have enough CO2. You're more fidgety and more stressed. You're struggling to breathe because CO2 is an actual bronchodilator, so it actually helps keep the airways open. It also keeps you calm if you retain the right amount of CO2. Too little makes us fidgety and agitated and stressed. As I mentioned before, we get into that vicious cycle. Very importantly, if you're blowing off too much CO2, then it tends to make the hemoglobin what we call sticky. So it's very difficult for the hemoglobin to be shed at the tissues, so that we actually feel air hunger and we breathe harder, and our circulatory system and our heart has to literally beat faster. We feel breathless, so we gulp air more. Also, if we blow out too much CO2 and we're mouth breathing, then we tend to have a dry mouth, we tend to have a dirtier mouth, because because of the sympathetic response. If we're in fight and flight mode, then our saliva dries up because it's the body's rallying to other systems such as muscles and heart, and the sort of more background functions of the body take a second place, of which saliva secretion is one. Also, if we're blowing off too much CO2, we have an associated sore, stiff neck, and a lot of people with a stiff neck and neck problems are mouth breathers and don't know it. One of the other less well-known correlated factors is also poor posture, and also a weakening of the pelvic floor. The diaphragm has to work hard against the pelvic floor, and if the diaphragm's not, and the pelvic floor will contract to control that, if you like. But if the diaphragm's weak and not pushing against the pelvic floor has nothing to react against, and the pelvic floor gets weak. So this vicious cycle of many different arrows coming into the one cycle. This chronic sympathetic arousal we call to fear and flight. We're using these muscles here. That also tends to affect our shoulder muscles because the brachial plexus literally has to squeeze out through the muscles of the neck, and if they're constantly in arousal, the neck muscles, then that is handicapped, if you like. The shoulders become hunched, the whole kit and caboodle really. With the shoulders hunched, the neck shortens, the jaw tightens, but the arm muscles become weak, the shoulder muscles become weak, and you can't lift properly. Lifting the kettle, you can't do it with your shoulder only, and that's when you tend to see that sort of little old lady's hunched shoulder trying to lift the kettle. So again, a whole lot of factors all swarming around and joining as one. Who would have thought that lazy mouth breathing could cause such mischief? So going back through it again, disturbed acid-alkali or the pH balance of the blood, respiratory problems because you don't have enough bronchodilator there, then you're struggling with the tubes of your lungs constricted, and you can often get wheezing, which is known as asthma. You also have an impaired immune response because you're not shunting the lymph around as well. Because you're actually you're not getting enough oxygen delivered to the tissues, you're having to increase the heart rate to pump more blood there to try and get more oxygen there. The other thing that happens is that you get a raised allergic response, raised stress, lots of anxiety. Mood swings and depression are very much associated with poor breathing habits. Conversely, one of the greatest advances in modern medicine, in a recent article in the Scientific American, is how breathing alone can control and lift you out of depression. Other less well-known influences: impaired mental faculties and poor concentration, poor digestion, poor sleep. Again, you're snoring, sleep apnea too, because you've got such poor mechanisms and the mouth stays open all night basically. And blowing off too much CO2 doesn't kick on your respiratory centre properly. The other thing that happens if you're mouth breathing is that you get up in the night and go to the loo a lot, again because of the constriction of the smooth muscle of all your systems, whether it be cardiovascular, digestive or urinary. That smooth muscle constricts, which means that your bladder constricts, which is why you're going to the loo through the night. Nocturia is one of the telltale signs of poor breathing during sleep. Other factors can increase your difficulty breathing, and one of them is the obsession with doing abs work, creating the six-pack, literally cinching in your abdomen so that you're actually reducing the space where the diaphragm can come down. So you get this reflex underactivity of your lower abs, overactivity of the neck muscles, overactivity of the upper abs. That too causes a ballooning effect on the pelvic floor. And remember, stress incontinence is very common, particularly with elite athletes when they do a lot of this sort of workout stuff. Now, this is very common, mouth breathing in children. It's thought to be related to a lot of the poor foods available in the supermarkets. Again, they have this typical long face with their mouth open and their tongue down, whereas normally the tongue should be on the roof of the mouth, lightly against the roof of the mouth. When you don't have that, then the pressure of the tongue, which is a very strong organ, does not press the cheeks out, and literally they get these narrow faces, smudgy marks under the eyes. Again, they often are diagnosed with ADHD. They've often got a sort of stuffed up adenoidal way of talking. And importantly too, they often have crooked teeth. Again, because the pressure of the tongue behind the teeth creates that lovely even set of choppers, which we'd all like our kids to have. So there we go.